Vice Dean of the National University of Singapore's School of Public Policy. Professor Tan, thank you for joining us. There is, of course, many questions to be asked about where Singapore goes in the future, but if we focus on this moment, it's not often you bury a founding father, is it?
No, this is the first time that Singapore has done it at this level and scale. And I think what we're seeing in terms of the outpouring of emotions is something that's very necessary at this point of time. This has to happen. Feelings have to emerge out of this occasion. They have to get it out of their system before we can actually come together again rationally to think about where Singapore should go. What of this legacy should we take with us into the future, and what of this legacy should we not?
If we look at the funeral and where the procession is actually going to go, of course, the actual funeral will be at the National University of Singapore at the Cultural Centre. The body must be moved from Parliament House. It's going to pass a lot of very significant landmarks in the life of Lee Kuan Yew, isn't it?
Yes, definitely. I think many of these landmarks are emblematic of the many public institutions that have had their establishment as a result of Lee Kuan Yew's own efforts and his own convictions about what has been important in Singapore's development. Certainly industrial relations, the management of labour, education, the public housing experience, all these things are really foundational to Singapore's very successful starting points.
And we look at some of the pictures we're seeing as people gather, of course, it's not just Singaporeans who are gathering, it's also world leaders. We have the Prime Minister of Australia, we have the Prime Minister of India, the President of Indonesia, the Prime Minister of Japan, Vice President of China, we have William Hague, former Foreign Secretary from the UK, we have former President Bill Clinton from the US. What does that say about Lee Kuan Yew as a man?
Well, it reflects the stature of Lee Kuan Yew, not only as a person of great intellect, whose analysis of the world is greatly sought after by the great and the good all over the world, but also as a person who enjoyed deep friendships with political leaders around the world. And I think those deep friendships are also a very good foundation for Singapore's foreign policy and foreign relations. I think the West, in particular, leaders in the West have found Mr. Lee's analysis, geopolitical analysis of Asia, of how Asians think, and in particular how China thinks, to be particularly valuable. And by the same token, leaders in Asia and in China have also been very curious about what the West thinks about themselves. And so Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, I think, was very useful to all these parties in offering the kind of analysis that...
he played go-between for many countries.
He did as well, he did. So he provided analysis, but he was also, in some respects, an active participant in trying to ensure that there is global order, that relations were peaceful amongst the major players. And a part of Singapore's grand strategy, I think, to make itself as many friends as possible, but also to be as useful to its friends and those who are less friendly to Singapore as well.
Do you think, Professor Tan, that people are going to wake up tomorrow and feel, well, it's the end of a chapter, it's the end of an era, but that issue of what next? I mean, of course, the Lee Kuan Yew's son, his eldest son, is the current Prime Minister, Lee Hsien Loong. But will that question now come to the fore with the passing of Lee Kuan Yew?
I think the question has always been on people's minds generally, right? And it is not inconsistent with Singapore's method of governance. In fact, to think about the future, to think about sustainability in the long term. Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, I think, had always considered the question of leadership succession. Even in the late 70s, he spoke about these kinds of things. And I think one of his greatest contributions is actually turning Singapore into a place which depended at one time on wise and great leaders, into a place that can depend on institutions, strong institutions, less reliant on strong, good and wise leaders. I think if we were to continue in this fashion, we would leave a lot of Singapore's fortunes to just luck, and that's not a very sound basis for the future.
Yeah, there's much debate to be had about what next for Singapore. Professor Kenneth Paul Tan, many thanks for talking to us today. Kenneth Paul Tan, who's the Vice Dean at the National University of Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Professor Tan, this is really an extraordinary day, isn't it?
It really is. I think the fact that so many people of significance around the world have come to congregate here in Singapore to pay their respects, I think is an indication of the stature of Mr. Lee, certainly the contributions that he has made towards an understanding through deep and insightful analysis of geopolitics in the world today and how to achieve order. I think these are things that are valuable and certainly recognized as a
Well, was that, I suppose, a very deliberate measure of Lee Kuan Yew to do that, to try and make these relationships strong, to make Singapore larger than it was? It's such a tiny red dot, that's what it's known as, the tiny red dot. But by having these strong relationships, by making himself a presence on the world stage, he actually made Singapore bigger.
I would agree with that totally. I think it's a very disproportionate influence that he and then Singapore has in the world. Certainly we're very small and we're tucked away on the map. And the kind of influence that we exert, not only in terms of intervening into the affairs of global politics, but just the idea of Singapore and what Singapore represents for people who are thinking about development, people who are thinking about governance and policy making. It offers a vision of what things could be. In fact, it's really at the heart of what we try to do at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, where 80% of our students are actually from overseas. And they come largely because of this fascination for the Singapore way.
But this is an interesting question, isn't it? I know today is the day of the funeral, but it's the end of an era. And the next question for Singapore is, well, if this is a turning point, what next? And there was another side to Lee Kuan Yew. He did rule authoritarianly, if you like, and this is one of the most regulated societies in the world. What does happen next? What changes?
Well, it's very hard to say what will actually happen next. We have to leave a lot of this in the hands of Singaporeans themselves. But I would imagine that out of that authoritarian experience of Mr. Lee's rule will come out strong institutions. And I think
but perhaps too strong? Institutions that have managed to dampen anything but what the government wants?
That could well be. I mean, I think at the heart of it, we need to have government in any case, right? If we were talking about opening up, democratization, I would say that we need to have government that has the capacity to maintain spaces where a wide variety of views can actually be expressed and that they can lead to decisions and outcomes that Singaporeans would be happy with. I think one thing that's often said in Singapore is that we may not be ready for a complete opening up. I have misgivings about too much delay, but I think that it is actually true that if we didn't look after the space and have government that is strong enough to maintain the space, it could quite easily collapse into the worst kind of populism. And I think that's probably at the back of the minds of a lot of Singaporeans who are eagerly anticipating a bigger space, more participation, more involvement. But we want to be able to do this in conditions of stability and safety and order.
There is indeed, though, of course, those who do want change, and it will be interesting to see how after this day that change comes about. Many thanks for talking to us. Professor Kenneth Paul.